Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about a couple of aspects that I think fit into the motivation, the general motivation for this course, and the way we go about teaching it. There are two pieces to this. One, of course, is the decision to make the cardiovascular system the theme of this particular course. The second one is the way we use animals and models out of the animal kingdom to reinforce some of the key physiological concepts. The idea here is to show that different species can solve the same problems, the same environmental, external, or even internal challenges in different ways. And hopefully I'll be able to convince you that that's a pretty helpful way to think about it, especially as a biomedical engineer, given our very diverse and interesting career paths. So first of all, why cardiovascular physiology? Well, there's maybe the most obvious and pressing motivation is it remains within humans the leading cause of death. Overall, this has been the case for many, many years. And yes, while the rates of cardiovascular death have decreased with time, our research has been successful, our medicine has been successful, it still is the number one killer. It actually, unfortunately, kills in the Western world, in the United States, more people than cancer and several other diseases combined. So it really is a dominant source of death, and that arguably is a significant motivation. Even at the time of COVID, we still had cardiovascular death outstripping all other causes for death. There are many forms of cardiovascular disease. We'll cover some of those in the course. Each one of them has a different likelihood, a different frequency in the population, and hence plays a different role in this overall statistic. One of the things that we also notice, and you can see that here in the graph from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, that the rates of death across the sexes are somewhat similar. They're not so dissimilar as in other diseases. They're not perfectly aligned, not perfectly balanced. But this is a disease that affects men and women in different ways at different times of their lives, but overall in equal measure. So this is a disease that everybody has to be concerned with, and certainly we should know more about it. One of the interesting aspects of cardiovascular disease is that there's regional disparity. It turns out the rates of cardiovascular disease, that can be heart disease, that could be cerebral disease, so the disease that affects brain attacks, the clots that form in our brain, the bleeds we have in our brain, all these, this cardiovascular envelope is quite broad, but everything that fits under that envelope, you can see in this graph here that shows the distribution across the country. And what's kind of amazing when you look across the country is that there are such amazing discrepancies. It turns out that certain parts of the country have historically had a higher rate of cardiovascular disease. And we can see that here very, very clearly. We can speculate perhaps on why that might be, what the motivation, or let's say what the mechanisms might be. But at this point, that's really very speculative. We have to be careful about the conclusions that we might jump to. But the fact of the matter is that certain parts of the country, and we're fortunate enough that Utah is one of them, as are the Four Corner states generally, have much lower rates of cardiovascular death than other regions in the middle part of the South, for example, and certain areas in the Northeast. So the correlations are difficult, and they have lots and lots of factors, and we're not going to be able to get into all of them, but hopefully at least a few of them. Now, we also know internationally there's disparities. Certain countries are more likely to have their citizens suffer from sudden death and cardiovascular death than others. And what they're calling Russian Federation here, Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, these were all former East Bloc countries. When they were united into the USSR, they were the dominant source of cardiovascular death, the highest numbers of cardiovascular death. And that continues among many of these countries now that the Federation has split up. We see a larger disparity between men and women in some of these countries with high incidence rates than we see in some of the ones with the lower rates. But there still is overall a slightly higher prevalence of the disease in men than in women. And you see the United States is ranking somewhere, just out of the top 10 in terms of cardiovascular death. So again, It's easy to speculate, but then there are these contradictory findings. You could suggest maybe it's the East Bloc and something about the lifestyle there, and then you see Cuba. And you could say, well, maybe it has to do with politics, and then you see Brazil, and you see Argentina, and you see Mexico. So all these different countries, different climates, different ethno-genetic backgrounds. And so it becomes very challenging to actually drill down and determine why cardiovascular death is the way it is. And there are, again, many reasons. We won't touch on them all. And that's not really our goal. We're not here to learn medicine or to learn public health. We're here to learn the mechanisms that we could use to try and tackle some of these problems if that later became a focus of our research or our careers, literally our jobs. And we see that this trend and the time frame at risk changes or is different between males and females. Men have their highest risk at a different age than women. We also see that over time, the risk of disease for men and women has shifted. In the early years, the late 70s, early 80s in this graph, you can see that males had an increased risk of cardiovascular death. Now, we as engineers, I would argue, should have kind of a special affinity with cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular physiology especially. It has so many embedded aspects of a broad range of engineering disciplines that I think we should be comfortable with it. We should be able to understand it in a way that maybe somebody with a different background might not. For example, the whole nature of blood as a liquid. It's thicker than water, has very unusual characteristics. That makes it a little bit tricky. This is a little more complicated than dealing with water flowing through a pipe. And so in some regards, this is more challenging. But I think it's a challenge we rise to when we start to drill a little bit more deeply into the characteristics of blood and how it behaves the way it does. It's a physics-based problem in most cases, and so we can use our physics training and our mechanical engineering training to address that. Blood vessels are not pipes. They're not rigid pipes, and so again, we're comfortable usually thinking about flow. We have equations that describe flow in pipes, but we have pipes that are not rigid. We have distensible or compliant pipes, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail soon. So they're elastic. They're even contractile. So they're pipes whose dimension doesn't remain constant over time, is obviously not constant throughout the body, but again, can vary and do vary. These diameters do vary with time, and that has a great deal to do with the way blood flow is regulated. And we'll certainly drill down into that topic. The heart is an interesting organ. At one level, you think, it's a pump. Engineers understand pumps quite easily, but it's an unusual pump. It's what we call a permissive pump. It's a pump whose output matches its input. So the driver is not to achieve a certain level of output, as you might think. The goal of the pump, if you will, or the function of the heart as a pump is such that the output matches the input. So there are mechanisms in place in the heart structure and in the way it contracts that ensure that no matter what volume of blood comes back to a healthy heart from the venous side of the system, that same volume over some short period of time, integrated over some period of time, that output matches the input. And that's, again, engineering, interesting engineering in practice. And of course, one has to then decide how is this achieved? What are the mechanisms by which living tissue can create that balance between input and output? Heart failure is a mechanical disease of the heart and is one major cause of death within the world of cardiology. So for the mechanical engineers, heart failure is a natural place to be. Electrical abnormalities are also a major cause of death. We think it's the cause of most of what we call sudden cardiac death. So that's interesting for the electrical engineers in the group. And a great deal of cardiac disease has to do with restricted blood flow through the coronary arteries. So again, it's an interesting biomechanical problem that it turns out has electrical consequences. So we're living in this wonderfully integrated interdisciplinary space where we can take all our engineering knowledge and certainly our math and physics and imaging technology that we've learned and bring them all to bear to help us understand physiology in a way that's more challenging for many people who come from the biological disciplines. And the other concept that we have talked about before is the concept of homeostasis. And homeostasis and maintenance of homeostasis is really all about control. And this is another topic in engineering with which we should have some familiarity. Control systems are what make sure that our elevators stop on the right floors. There's control systems all around us. It's what makes the heating systems work in our homes and in buildings. So control systems, again, should be a comfortable space with a vocabulary that's somewhat known to us. And we can take all that knowledge and apply it very directly to physiology. And that's what we're going to be doing. So the second chapter, the second facet I wanted to discuss here is why we use animal physiology. And I think there are a number of reasons, of really compelling reasons. And one of them is that animals do things in amazing ways. Animals have physiological systems that we as humans can't match. A camel can drink enormous quantities of water, well beyond the amount normalized or however you want to measure it that we can drink. And then they can store that water and live on that water for exceedingly long periods of time, a lot longer than we can. This is what makes them so well suited to life in the desert and dry climates. Very small animals at the other end, the kangaroo rat, which actually lives in southern Utah, is an amazing example of an animal that preserves water as well, but in a very small scale, and actually never drinks water or may never drink water during its lifetime. It's able to extract water from its food. It's able to conserve water and moisture in many systems in its body. It's able to produce urine that is more concentrated than our human urine, and it has a set of adaptations that allow it to survive in a truly harsh environment that we clearly cannot survive in without external assistance. So just recognizing those variations within the animal world gives us insight into the full range of physiology. And while you could say that's going to be interesting from an intellectual perspective, and of course we want to be well-rounded, it has direct consequences when we then move into the biomedical engineering domain. Because a lot of biomedical engineering has as one of its goals to produce prosthetic or replacement organs. So we have artificial joints, we have artificial limbs, we're moving toward artificial kidneys. That is, dialysis is arguably an artificial kidney. We've certainly made progress in artificial hearts, and hopefully you know something about that history here in Utah. Utah was the place with the first artificial heart ever transplanted in a human, and we continue to strive toward that end game. Along the way, there are assist devices, ventricular assist devices that work very effectively in patients, and that's a research topic that's very relevant to Utah. So we develop artificial organs, broadly speaking, and prosthetic devices, broadly speaking. And it makes sense when we're trying to come up with a technical replacement for a physiology, a human physiology, that we also look to the animal kingdom. It could be that the solutions that those animal systems have developed are better suited to artificial reconstructions than the native systems in human physiology. And so we benefit when we're able to have this broad set of systems, of solutions, of physiological achievements across the animal species to call upon when we're tasked with coming up with an artificial replacement, partial or complete, for a human system in our bodies. And so this is simply relevant for us in that domain. A third reason that's very critical for many of us who do research is the use of animals in our research. Animals are naturally very important as trial preparations in animal research for veterinary medicine, but also in their use in human medicine. We cannot develop and test the medications, the procedures, surgical, all sorts of important aspects of current medicine and future medicine without the use of animals. This is an interesting topic, has lots of ethical dimensions, and maybe we'll have time to discuss that. I'm happy to go deeper into that. But the point is that we simply cannot at this point do without our animal models, even as we strive toward replacing them with computer simulations or cell-based models or tissue models that we develop through synthetic means. But we're not there yet. And so when we use animals in research, it's incredibly important, of course, that we know the limitations, strengths, and similarities between the animal species we have available to us and the humans they're trying to simulate. If I'm trying to understand how the human heart responds to cardiovascular disease, broadly speaking, or specifically coronary artery disease, which is a shortfall of blood in the coronary arteries, I have to know in that animal model, is that animal likely to respond in a way that mimics human behavior? Because if it doesn't, I will get results that I'll have to adapt or shift or somehow speculate about before I can apply them to humans. And so understanding how animals solve their physiological challenges, how their cardiovascular physiology works, helps me enormously in the research that I and my colleagues and my students actually pursue. And finally, there's another area of understanding of animals that's practically important, and that's simply in the business of agriculture. This is animals are used in agriculture. They're in old days, they used to be used as engines, essentially, so we had to understand their physiology in that context, and to some extent they still are. And of course, they're used enormously as food. And so understanding how to raise them, how their physiology works, how to keep them healthy, that's an important economic driver. And we can't ignore that. So I would argue, in summary, no matter what your perspective, there are compelling and interesting reasons why animal physiology is a good framework in which to tackle this topic. And that's what we're going to do. Thanks very much for listening. Hope this provided a little bit of motivation and understanding of some of the decisions that we make in this course and that maybe you made taking this course. And we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks so much for your attention.